In this lesson, we'll learn about Illustrator's brush panel. Okay, so in the previous lesson, we were talking about how we can draw freeform paths using both the pencil tool and the paintbrush tool. Now, we spent most of our time talking about the pencil tool, but I also talked about the paintbrush tool at the very end, and I mentioned that it works in a very similar fashion to the pencil tool. The main difference being that instead of drawing a path, the paintbrush tool actually paints with a brush stroke. Now, I also mentioned that all the brush strokes for our documents are managed through our brushes panel here. Now really, because of these brush strokes, the paintbrush transitions more from a drawing tool like the pencil tool into more of a painting tool that we can actually paint with. Now, hopefully by the end of this lesson you'll understand what I'm talking about, and we're going to just walk through this brush panel and some of the basic brushes that we can create using this brush panel. So I've got 5 different types of brushes here that we can create within Adobe Illustrator. Now, I've got examples of those here on our screen in front of us. Let's just kind of walk through these. Now, the first one is going to be our calligraphic brush. Now, let me just zoom in on these so we can take a good look at this. This brush right here. Now, notice here that as I selected that path, the brush that we used to stroke that path here got a little white outline around it. Now, this is the brush stroke we are applying to this path, and as a matter of fact, this entire row of brushes they're all calligraphic brushes. You can see here, if you look at this path, how there's some really nice thick and thins to this, really mimicking a calligraphy brush. So that's the first brush type we can create here in Illustrator. Let's look here at the second type, this path right here with all the ellipses along it. They're scattered randomly. This is actually called a scatter brush. And if we look in our brush panel, you can see here that in this second row we have the scatter brush. Now, this next row here actually has the word basic next to the stroke. Now, this is actually not a brush type. This is actually what we would click if we want to actually revert back to a default stroke weight. Let's go ahead and click that and see what happens on this calligraphy brush here. If we click that here, you can see here we go back to a normal path with just a 1-point regular stroke applied to it. There's no actual brush stroke applied here. Let me undo that here. We can actually also remove a brush stroke by clicking on this button at the bottom of the window right there. And again, you can see it has the same effect. There's one other way we can remove that. We can come up here and just say remove brush stroke from the panel options menu. So let's go ahead and talk about our third type of brush here. Now, this is actually called an art brush. You can see here it looks like some kind of a dry media was dragged along our artboard here in the direction of this path. Now, you can see this art brush exists right here in our brush panel. As a matter of fact, there's several art brushes listed in this area right here. This is sort of a cache of recently used brushes. So you can see here we've got sort of a glyph that exists right there, and again, that is an art brush. We've got a couple of other art brushes here below that, and this next brush, let's go ahead and move on, is actually the fourth type of brush that we can create here in Illustrator. This is actually called a natural bristle brush. Now, this is actually a brush type that is new in Illustrator CS5, and it was developed to mimic the brushes a traditional artist uses on a canvas or even a watercolor piece of paper. So if we zoom in and look at that, you're going to get a better idea of what that brush stroke looks like. And you can see here we also have a preview of what the tip of that brush looks like. This 3.00 right here relates to the size of the brush, so that's a 3mm brush. Let's go ahead and zoom out, and we've got one other sort of oddball brush here. Everything else is on a curved path, and this brush type is actually applied to a rectangle. This is called a pattern brush, and pattern brushes really excel at creating borders and things like that. Now, before we start looking at ways to create these brushes, let's go ahead and spend a little more time looking at this panel and looking at what we can do within this panel. So let's come in here now, and there's one other button we haven't talked about down here on the right-hand side of the bottom. This is the Stroke Options button, and this button brings up options that are specific to the object we have selected. So if we were to go ahead and click on the options for that object here, you're going to see we get objects specific to this particular brush stroke. Now, these options look a little bit different than the options we're presented with to create a custom pattern brush, but we know it's a pattern brush because it says that right up on the top of this dialog. So I'm not going to go through all these. We're going to talk about all these here in just a moment, but let's go ahead and take a look here at our panel options menu. Now if we click that, we've got the options to create a new brush, we can delete a brush, or we can duplicate one of these brushes, and we can really do those same things down here, creating a new brush with this button, deleting a brush with this button, or dragging one of these brushes to the new brush button to duplicate it. Now let's just say for a moment we had way too many brushes in our brush panel here and we wanted to sort of clean this up. Now your brush panel is actually independent to your Illustrator document, so you don't have to worry about these brushes following you from one Illustrator document into another. Each document's going to have its own brushes. So let's come in here and actually you can select all unused brushes if you want. And you can see several of them get outlines around them, and we can go ahead and delete any of these brushes here. So we're not going to lose them. We can always bring them back just by creating a new document. Now if we were to look again in this panel menu, you see here there's some options to hide specific types of brushes here. We can hide any of those 5 brush categories and they're not going to show up in our brush panel. So just some different options for hiding brushes and removing brushes in case you get a lot of different types of brushes in your panel. Now we also have a different type of view. We have list view. Right now we're in thumbnail view. Let's go ahead and click on list view here, and you can see here that this is sort of a more compacted view. Now we don't get quite as nice of a preview of each of these brush strokes, but this might be advantageous if you're dealing with multiple brushes here. Now let's just say for a moment that you want to actually save your brushes out of this Illustrator document so you can use them in other documents. Let me come back over to thumbnail view here. Now that's entirely possible. All you need to do in order to do that is come over here to your panel options menu and choose Save Brush Library. Now by default this is going to start you in a brushes folder that's actually within your CS5 install directory somewhere, buried sort of deep down in there. Now if you do not choose to save your brushes into this file, then they're not going to show up when you browse your brush libraries inside Illustrator. Naturally you can save your brushes wherever you want to. Maybe you're going to email them to a friend, or you're going to move them over to an external media drive so you can move them to a different computer. But just know that if you don't save them in this brushes folder, then they're not going to show up when you're browsing your libraries here from this brush dialog. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll go ahead and cancel this, and let's come over here, and right here we have our brush libraries, or access to those. So let's go ahead and click this, and again we have a Save Brushes option right here, but you can see here that Illustrator actually ships with a number of default brush libraries that we have access to. So we have several different ones here that we can open, or we can actually browse to one saved anywhere and open that library as well. I don't know if you can see this or not, but right here, the very last option before Other Library, it says User Defined, but it's grayed out. It's because I haven't created any custom brush libraries yet, but if I had, this is where they would appear under User Defined. Now, I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and look at how we could possibly create one of these new brushes. Let's go ahead and create a brush right here with this Create New Brush button. You can see we're only presented with 3 different options, not 5. Now the reason for this is because these 2 brushes that are grayed out actually require that we have artwork selected in order to be able to create one of those brushes. So we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. Let's go ahead and select calligraphic brush here. I'm going to hit OK on this dialog, and you can see here that we can name our brush, and we have a brush tip preview box here, as well as a preview box to the right of that. Now this is the shape of our brush tip, and what gives a calligraphic brush its nice thick and thin feel is the fact that its tip is not a perfect circle. So because of that, we can actually come in here and grab either one of these little black circles, and we can adjust the tip shape of our brush simply by doing that. If you look down below, you can see the percentage of our roundness is actually increasing and decreasing based on how we modify that brush tip shape. Now we can also rotate that brush tip shape as well, and we can do that simply by grabbing this little arrow right here. Let's just grab that and rotate it, and in doing this you can see the degree of our angle is changing as well. Now we have one other line item here that we have an option for, and we have a slider for this, or we can manually enter a number. This is for the diameter of our brush. Now that's pretty self-explanatory, but let's go ahead and take a look at these little drop-down menus just to the right of that. Now these are a little different. They all say fixed. Let's say that we're working on a tablet with a pen stylus, and we want our brush to be based on the pressure sensitivity of our tablet. I use that setting quite a bit with my own tablet, so we would come down here to say diameter, and let's maybe change the diameter to pick up on pressure right here. Now we can do it randomly. We can do it based on a stylus wheel if we have one of those. tilt of our pen, bearing, or rotation. I use pressure mostly when I'm using a different option other than fixed, and you can see in choosing that here we get a variation slider, so we can choose how much variation appears between the smallest area of our stroke and the largest area. Now I'm not going to go ahead and create a calligraphic brush right now, but I do want to show you a couple of other types of brushes. Let's take a look at the natural bristle brush. I'm going to go ahead and create another new brush here, and I'm going to select bristle brush right here from the dialog that pops up. Now we get several other options here. Now these are all related to creating a brush that feels like a traditional brush that an artist would use. So we have here the shape of the tip of our brush. We can choose round, and we can choose really any one of these different types of brush tips. And after we've selected that, we can come down here and we have a nice preview area of what our brush is going to look like. Maybe we choose this round fan option. And I tell you what, we have some other options here like size, bristle length, bristle density, bristle thickness, paint opacity, and stiffness. All of these can be customized to create exactly the look and feel that we want out of our brush. So I'd encourage you to play with these, see what you can't create. Now again, Illustrator does include that brush library for bristle brushes, and there's a lot of preset brushes that have been created in there. You feel free to play with those as well. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel this now. And I want to look at one other type of brush before we end this lesson here. I'm going to go ahead and select a little ellipse that I have right here. Now, let's talk about a scatter brush. Scatter brush has quite a few different options. I'm going to go ahead and create another brush here, and because I have artwork selected, notice that all 5 are available to me. So let's go ahead and select scatter brush here. And a scatter brush gives you a lot of options. It has a size option, spacing, scatter, and rotation. Now we can adjust these however we want to. This one only has one slider. It's set to 100% size, depending on how large we want that to get. Now, keep in mind that with a scatter brush, maybe you want it to have some variation to it. And quite often when I'm creating a scatter brush, I indeed do want it to do that. So we have these drop downs over here. Now this is where I'll use this random option quite a bit. I'll set several of these to random. Now obviously, since we're using a perfect circle here, it's not gonna matter if we set the rotation any, but if you're using a shape other than a circle, you can actually scatter the rotation as well. So we can scatter any one of these. Let's say we scatter the size randomly. Notice that in doing that we actually receive a second arrow here. We now have 2. The black one's going to control where our size is going to top out, and the white one's going to control where it's going to bottom out. So the minimum possible size and the maximum possible size. We can also change the rotation of our object relative to the page or the path simply by dropping that down, and we have some colorization options here. Right now it's set to none. Now if we drop this little box down, you can see here that we can vary the colorization method by tints, and shades, or we can actually shift the hue. Now the hue shifting is based on the key color for your brush stroke. Now the key color here is black, and by default the key color is set to the most dominant color in your artwork. Now we can actually change that by clicking on this little eyedropper tool here and selecting a different color, but these are the scatter brush options in Illustrator. Let's go ahead and cancel this out here. And there's actually a couple other brushes we haven't talked about yet. There's the art brush and the pattern brush. So we're going to pick up in the next lesson where we're leaving off here. We're going to talk about the art brush and the pattern brush.